angry, we were young, we were frustrated about the war. It seemed that the shooting would never stop. The 13 seconds seemed to go on and on and on. And I encourage the young people of America to understand and to perpetuate the long-standing tradition of American student activism.
He does a lot of writing, he does a lot of lecturing. He is the archivist of May 4th, 1970.
And the student voice is still heard today. I think it's an echo of our voices from the 1960s and 1970s.
He did not die that day, but his life was changed forever.
We grew up in the 1950s, which was a time of peace and relative prosperity in America.
Alan was always political. I do remember that about him.
My dad and his liberal, pro-union, pro-democrat politics had a big impact on me.
There's an old Italian philosophy. The apple don't fall too far from the tree.
When I was 7 years old, I was kneeling by the side of my bed as a good Catholic boy, saying my prayers and praying, among other things, that Adlai Stevenson would defeat Dwight Eisenhower for the presidency in 1956.
He was the all-American boy, like any parent would want their son to be.
I was a good student, I had good grades. I was on a track to go to college. I think everybody in my hometown totally supported the war in Vietnam. But when I went to college, when I first got to the Kent State campus, that's when I started hearing the voices of dissent.
Kent State had a very active SDS, Students for a Democratic Society organization. And there was a pretty active anti-war movement on campus.
It was really within a matter of months that he began to change.
I started to read a lot of books and magazines. You know, I started letting my hair grow long, and I started to associate with the counterculture.
When Alan's best friend died in Vietnam, I saw a dramatic change in him and my daughter.
That image was etched into my mind, even as it is today. The image of his coffin with the American flag draped over it and his 19-year-old dead body inside. That had a big impact on me. And that's why only 6 days later, when President Nixon invaded Cambodia with U.S. troops, we knew that we had to take a stand here in Kent, Ohio, to try to stop that war.
Something just sparked.
The Cambodian invasion was such a shock and sort of re-energized the anti-war movement, because not only was the war not winding down, it was spreading.
And we were shouting at the television, we were angry, we felt betrayed, and there was a spontaneous rebellion in downtown Kent. We were all down there. Some of us started spray painting anti-war slogans on the walls.
You know, watching a building being spray painted with U.S. out of Cambodia now. And I remember for the first time I didn't see that as an illegal act. I saw it as a necessary response to Nixon's invasion.
And then we moved down Water Street, heading south, toward the center of town here. You could just hear the sound of rocks and bottles hitting the windows of the banks, the loan companies, and eventually the utilities when we went around the corner.
It was righteous anger in downtown Kent on Friday night, and I just remember thinking it was really, really necessary and really very right.
So that set the stage then for the next day, Saturday, May 2nd.
The trouble in town sort of moved to the campus, and there was an attack on the ROTC building, the Reserve Officers Training Corps.
So it was a symbol of the war in Vietnam.
They were burning ROTC buildings all over the country. And I don't think they sent in the National Guard.
That the guardsmen must have been waiting just outside of town, waiting for an excuse to invade Kent. Jeeps, tanks, armored personnel carriers, they came rolling into town. It looked like something out of World War II. Governor James Rhodes was a very conservative, pro-war Republican governor. So he gave this real tough law and order speech. He pounded his fist on the podium and he said, "These Kent State students are the worst type of people we harbor in America." And he concluded by saying,
"We are going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms."
Governor Rhodes came into a very volatile, unstable situation and threw gasoline on the fire.
The federal government came on our campus with Guardsmen and M1 rifles, which are very powerful.
I was in 2 infantry divisions in World War II. I could put an M1 rifle together with my eyes closed. Little did I realize that when I had that rifle, that one day that rifle would actually shoot my son.
Monday morning, May 4th, things opened as normal as you can be when you have guardsmen all over the campus. Guardsmen inside buildings, guardsmen patrolling around jeeps. And a rally had been called for noon.
I walked past a line of guardsmen, and as I got past the last guardsman who was standing there, he shouted over to me and he said, "Hey boy, what's that you're carrying?" And I said, "Just a couple of black flags." And he said to me, ominously, I think, in a threatening way, he said, "Well, today we're going to make you eat those flags."
A jeep drove out and said, with a Kent State officer in it and a police officer, said, "This rally is illegal, you shouldn't be here, go home."
Leave this area immediately. For all you innocent bystanders, leave this area immediately.
And people started laughing. I mean, it was truly a peaceful gathering.
Originally, we were just going to go there to protest the invasion of Cambodia, but by May the 4th at noon, I think we were out there for a second reason as well, equally. We were there to protest the invasion of our campus by the National Guard. So we just stood our ground.
And it was then that the National Guard began to advance.
Here comes the tear gas. A barrage of tear gas repeatedly fired toward us. Students picked up the tear gas canisters, threw it back toward the National Guard. It was like just back and forth, and it was like cat and mouse chasing around the campus.
Just one contingent of the National Guardsmen knelt down on their knees in a single line formation and started aiming their guns.
I was about 250 feet away, waving a black flag, looking at the guard and shouting at them.
They were looking through the scopes of their rifles right at Alan.
My sister came up to me as the guards started to leave the practice football field.
And I was just saying, "Alan, you know, what are you doing? Don't get close to them. You know, they were aiming right at you."
Well, just a minute, I'm going to see where these guys are going. And they were carrying guns. That's all we knew. And we sure didn't know that the guns were loaded.
They started up the hill, and Alan was walking toward their direction.
And that's when they decided to stop. Only Troop G, about a dozen men, stopped, turned, raised their weapons, and all simultaneously started to shoot. I took a quick step and I got behind this tree and I kneeled, and that's when I felt a bullet enter in through the front part of my wrist here, and it came out through the side.
Some fired in the air, some fired in the ground, but some fired directly into the parking lot.
We got behind the car. We could hear the bullets ricocheting off the steel body of the car.
I can't believe it. I've really been shot.
Hear bullets thumping in the grass to the left of us, whizzing by.
67 shots were fired from high-powered rifles down a hill into a crowd of unarmed students.
4 students were killed and 9 were wounded.
All 4 students were killed at distances of about 275 feet to 400 feet away.
On May 4th, the war came home, and it was no longer in the jungles of Vietnam, but it was on the plains of Ohio.
It was a massacre. There was no reason to shoot that many bullets into a faraway parking lot. Once the shooting stopped, there was that long moment of silence, and then you began to hear people shout and scream from the pain and from the horror. And I looked over to my side. I saw my roommate, Tom Grace, was out in the open. I ran over to him. I was shot through the wrist, he was shot through the foot.
Our friend Eddie came up behind me and said, "Alan and Tom both got hit." And I just remember becoming weak in the knees and collapsing.
And my buddy come running into the office and he said, "They just shot people at Kent State." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "There's 4 dead, and there may be others." Every block you had to fight your way to get to the hospital.
And I remember seeing my mother's face when she first saw Alan. I'd never seen her before look so scared. She just collapsed into his arms and just held him and started crying when she saw him alive. And it was just the way I felt when I saw him too.
Kent was a lot like the rest of the country, equally divided between the pro-war and the anti-war side. Nixon blamed the victims immediately. Governor Rhodes blamed the victims immediately. Quite a few people who would say things like, well, they should have shot more of them. That gunfire would trigger the only national student strike in American history. Over 4 million students went on strike. 800 colleges and universities shut down because there was a sense of outrage that our innocence was destroyed, that Camelot was gone forever, and that it was a new day in America. President Nixon, in his memoir, said those were among the darkest days of his presidency.
There were 71 guardsmen on the Hill, only 28 fired. One explanation is that they panicked, thought they heard a noise or a shout. Another theory is that a small proportion of those who even fired worked it out ahead of time. A third explanation is they received a direct order to fire. In part, it happened because the Guard were put in with such massive force.
It was a formula for a disaster, and that's exactly what happened here at Kent State.
Alan is still as political as ever. Over the years, he has taken ownership of that event, and he has fought harder than anyone to bring out the truth of what happened there, to keep the memory of these 4 students alive.
I still take that duty very seriously. I think you could say that they died in vain if they were forgotten and if their deaths had no consequence. Even though we didn't intend to write such a dramatic chapter in American history, you could clearly say that the Kent State Massacre and the National Student Strike helped to stop the war in Vietnam. Some people try to portray me as one-dimensional. Oh, that Alan Canfora, he's obsessed about Kent State, I hear some people say. The fact of the matter is, I'm concerned about the issue, and I feel a duty, and I'm responding to the demand for the information.
He's dedicated his life to the student activism in America, and I can't stop that.
I think Alan Canfora is a person who has always followed in his father's footsteps, which is to care about the common people, the working people, the poor, the oppressed.
32 years later, I still admire him. I'm still watching him with awe.